We might just wait for a little bit just to make
Yeah,
sure
I was going to
everyone's
say,
in the
let's give it
room.
1 minute because you never know what happens with technology, and then we can get started. And just a reminder to make sure everyone is muted. Okay, I feel like 17 is solid. So I'm going to begin. Hi to those of you that don't know me. My name is Olivia Becker, and I am a student at the Ethical Culture Fieldston School, as well as the National Director of Outreach and Engagement for Next Gen Politics. So I'm just here to make sure this goes as smooth as possible and make it easy to present, as well as give feedback. Just a reminder that you can use the chat option in Zoom to provide feedback from that rubric that Sanda spoke about a minute ago, if you want to, but no pressure to do so. And with that, I'm happy to introduce the immigration group to present their civic action project. I'm going to use the chat link, by the way, to just give you guys timing updates so you don't run over time.
Thank you, Olivia.
All right, amazing. Sounds great. And we'll just be Makeda, I think, if you want to share your screen. All right, amazing.
Hi, I'm Makeda, and I'm one of the lead fellows at the immigration group. And so first, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction of our project and kind of what we did to get to where we are now. And so it all started when we listened to a forum in about January presented by Felipe de la Hoz, where he basically informed us about lawmakers, their policy, and just general knowledge that we don't often know about the immigration system. And then we had to select immigration as our civic action plan, and we went through a bunch of legislation and bill drafts in order to think about how we can make the immigration process more equal while also informing immigrants themselves of their rights. And so we began to formulate a plan to write something supporting like the passage of pieces of policy. So we were considering working with other organizations or like coming up with our own policy, in addition to like the distribution of a brochure or making some kind of documentary that would also be informing. And so then with the help of many resources available to us, we ultimately decided that like it was a lot more important to focus on the issues that we're facing currently, which were COVID-19. And so we wanted to look at how COVID-19 impacted the immigration process and current like legislation. And so in deciding on that to be our project, we first individually conducted a lot of researching regarding like the policies, the organizations, and the lawmakers, so that we could kind of figure out what next steps we needed to take in order to move forward. And so eventually we decided that the best way to get information out while also learning more ourselves about policy and kind of figuring out what another step we could take was, we decided that we had to make a podcast which would explain the impact that coronavirus has had on immigration and immigrant matters. And so we ended up reaching out to a lot of organizations, like even a lot more than we ended up interviewing. And and members of the group ended up interviewing city council members, law organizations, and individuals, and we asked them questions that were in conversation with each other, but not exactly the same, because each organization, each group had different experiences. And so then we split up the interviews by question, and members of the group cross-compared their similar questions in order to figure out more that we could get from our research and get more from the podcast in order to know what was most important to tell the public.
Okay, I guess I'll take it from here. Hi everyone, my name's Nathan. So we wanted to start with some background info into the status quo and what's going on. So the first thing is that, well, obviously this pandemic is affecting everyone. It's impacting undocumented immigrants in some of the hardest ways. The Washington Post recently explained that many don't have Social Security, health insurance, or paid sick leave, and they often work in some of the hardest hit sectors, mainly construction, hotellery, and food. So some of the impacts are quite disproportionate. But the second really important thing was the condition, especially in ICE detention centers. The Guardian recently found that the conditions in ICE detention centers were so bad that people were actually writing to judges asking to be deported. And just 11 days ago, we saw the first death of coronavirus in a detention center, and they've been reported to get worse and worse and worse ever since. So what's been done, as of March 11th, Trump closed down all the border with Europe, and then mid-March he closed down all the borders with Mexico and Canada, as well as every USCIS office. And there's been a lot of different proposals to solve or mitigate what's been currently happening. The two main ones that we wanted to go over is first, the idea that healthcare facilities and hospitals should be immigration enforcement free zone, meaning that we should allow immigrants to seek out medical services without any fear or repercussions based on their legal status. And then the second big proposal has been removing immigration barriers for medical professionals that are quite desperately in need right now.
Okay, wait, so I think
Lucy, do you want to?
I think she's not here for some reason. Lucy and Kate seem to have been not added to this room.
Yeah, they were put in different breakout rooms. So
Nathan, if you'd like to continue with
adjust
the
for that.
rest. Yeah, okay.
So I guess I'll continue. The last thing was going over Trump's response to the crisis. The first thing that we wanted to talk about is the fact that Trump has actually denied the proposal to make hospitals an immigration enforcement free zone. So that has had some pretty grave consequences. And then his administration has pushed for rules that have increased immigration enforcement for the past few weeks and have made it harder to gain permanent status for undocumented people right now and harder to receive public benefits, which has had some very serious consequences on the whole crisis. And then lastly, talking about hospitals, Trump and the DHS have all refused to let hospitals be immigration enforcement free zones, which has made it a lot harder for quite a few people to gain access to hospitalization services.
Okay. Awesome. So this is just a quick trailer for our Next Generation Politics podcast episode. I don't know if the sound is gonna work, Mark. Is it not? Okay, we can share that later with everyone if it doesn't work.
Yeah, feel free to put it in the chat, whatever link you have.
We'll just send it later in the link.
Access.
But we describe it anyway. So
play the email that you sent me later, like after.
Yeah. If we have time, we could just.
Nice.
All right, so moving on to our interviews. So first we interviewed members from nonprofit organizations who work with immigrant communities. So our two interviewees from this group was Wenny Chin, who's the Senior Manager of Civic Engagement at NYIC, which is the New York Immigration Coalition, and Jody Zeisimer, who's Director of the Immigration Project Unit at NYLAG, which is the New York Legal Assistance Group. All right. So one of the questions that I guess we kind of proposed to them was about the notable changes in the immigration system and handling that they've witnessed because of the pandemic. And we asked them to talk a little bit about what ICE and the DHS have done or changed in terms of their actions since the start of the crisis. So as you can see from the quotes that we provided, basically Wendy Chin was talking about how COVID-19, any treatment related to it is not a public charge. We know that certain communities are scared, and she actually further said that ICE and DHS have not really ceased their actions in terms of trying to maintain a strict actions when trying to deport immigrant communities, even during this crisis. So it just goes to show how very little care is given to immigrant communities who are both being uprooted by the pandemic and by deportation laws.
Hi, I'm Frank. I just wanted to add to what Sarah was saying. Jody also, brought up that there was very much of a contradiction between, what the president's policies regarding immigration during this time was, and also what ICE's policies during this time was, because, we're stopping immigrants from coming in, yet we're still letting immigrants go out, even though, and Jody brought this up, very few countries, no countries really are accepting any international travel. And yet she brought up this one fact that, we sent a plane load of deportees to Guatemala, which we strong-armed into accepting them. And when they tested us, 75% of those on board tested positive for coronavirus. So that really puts in perspective, what the recklessness of this administration in terms of what their immigration policy, especially during this time, really is.
So yeah, you can take this one.
All right. So, obviously this coronavirus epidemic is going to take a long time for us to heal from. And one of the main concerns for that Zeismer had over, how the immigration system was going to reopen, concerned the fact that the immigration system is a national system, right? And that influences what we are able to do at a local level, because, legislation and, the progress of how, we choose to reopen the immigration system is based on how the federal government responds, not how state governments or not how local governments respond. And so, if there are still places that are suffering from, the coronavirus epidemic, and there are still shutdowns going on in some places, there's going to be inconsistency on a national level as to what we're going to do in the next few months. And so, again, this is the national government we're talking about. So this is just going to slow down the rate at which the immigration system actually reopens. And again, we're talking about, individual lives here, and that's what really matters.
Okay, so in just terms of things that should be done / changed, Wendy Chin talked about the census and how we're not completing it, and that means that people are not being represented, which could affect next year's federal funding, which is a really important deal, and how also listeners should sort of think about how people can get civic engaged and allowing more immigrant communities to be able to vote, because right now, as they're frontliners in this issue, it's really hard for them to get involved civically, and so that's something to be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. And just briefly, Zeismer also mentioned that, of course, there needs to be a revision of the laws that we have in place concerning immigration, which, again, have really not been touched for about 30 years now. And also the fact that, the courts really need to be independent. And because the DOJ really slows them down, because they're part of this national bureaucracy. And if they were able to be independent, they would be able to process the cases that move through them a lot quicker.
All right. So the next part of our interviews was local state legislators who write and debate policies affecting immigration and immigrant communities. We were able to interview Carlos Menchaca, who's the guy to the left. He's the chair of the New York City Council's Committee on Immigration. And Gustavo Rivera, Senator Rivera, he's state senator representing the 33rd District and chairman of Committee on Health. So we're just going to quickly go over these interviews. Unfortunately, Kate, who's supposed to be presenting a bit more on this, isn't here, but just to quickly summarize, basically, we asked them what their largest priorities were in the immigrant communities and have their point of views changed during the crisis. So Mr. Menchaca talked about how healthcare is very important and that everyone should be getting to access to healthcare. And that's something that kind of has been infringing on a lot of immigrants' lives after they've contracted COVID and they've been scared to kind of, go to the hospital. And that's why communities of color are dying at higher rates. And then Senator Rivera talked about, society is not really kind of we've changed in some ways, but our points of views toward immigration have not really changed at all. We're not really thinking about our frontliners who are hard at work right now, and there isn't really anything to really help them, especially because the stimulus packages aren't really affecting them as well. Yeah, so this is kind of similarly, Senator Rivera talked about how the New York Healthcare Act is a bill that, would guarantee healthcare to undocumented people, and it should be passed, but it's something that's still being debated. And how Councilmember Menchaca was talking about everyone who needs a lawyer should be able to gain access to a lawyer, but right now there isn't the proper funding to provide those issues. Oh, Kate's here. Do you want to add anything really quickly?
Oh, no, I think you summarized it really well. Yeah, the New York Health Act is something that Senator Rivera is very passionate about, and that would, as it says here, create a single payer system in the state of New York. So really any New Yorker, regardless of immigration status, would have access to healthcare.
All right, I don't know is Lucy here?
No, Lucy's not
All
here.
right, if not, we'll just go really quickly into interviews part 3, which is individuals who've experienced immigrating to the US and have been impacted by COVID-19. So Elizabeth Remperada was willing to interview with us, and she immigrated to the US from Mexico 3 years ago. And so she isn't very fluent in English, but she did try her best, and for that we really thank her for sharing. And so here are some quotes by her. She talked about how she recently lost her job and members of her family have recently lost their jobs, how she herself contracted COVID-19 and was very scared because she was an immigrant, wasn't sure if she could go to the hospital, or she wasn't sure if doctors and nurses would attend to her. And she talks about how, immigrants such as herself lack a voice, and they need organizations to give them more information about their own rights, because they feel like that's what they're lacking the most. And she was very happy that we were actually interviewing her and getting these questions answered to share with the rest of the world, because it's something she feels is very valuable.
Yeah. Guys, just a time check. You're up. So yeah,
it's just our conclusion. So Mark, if you want to take the floor.
Mark?
You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Just to sum everything up, based on the interviews that we saw, there was a substantial amount of impact on the immigration system, specifically here in New York. So some of the changes that we found that were kind of unexpected weren't necessarily with regard to process, but more so about how immigrants, there were changes in how immigrants themselves felt and how they experienced the pandemic compared to others. And the restrictions imposed by this pandemic have definitely impacted the ways that the countries format their voting systems and the way that America itself has functioned in terms of a democracy. Also, if you'll check in the chat, I sent the link for the podcast trailer, so you're more than welcome to check it out.
awesome. Thank you guys. I know we can't do round of applause, but like jazz hands via Zoom would be awesome. The work you guys have put in is palpable, and it's so amazing. So now is time for about 7 minutes of question and answer from anyone who wants to ask about their experience or give a little bit of feedback on the presentation or the work they're doing. I can call on you. All you have to do is put your little blue hand up. So if you click on participants, you can just raise your hand.
Olivia, I also have the podcast trailer pulled up now, so if you want, I can share my screen and play that.
Okay, awesome. I'm gonna say we can do questions first, and then if we have more time, then we can do the podcast trailer. Yeah, Felipe, go for it.
Sorry, didn't unmute myself. Classic rookie mistake. How's everyone? You guys did really impressive work. With just what we so far. I can't wait to check out the podcast episode. I know it's been kind of a slog, and we had some plans at the beginning of this that didn't quite pan out with like immigration court and stuff, given the pandemic. And I know that I've been very slammed and I haven't been quite as responsive as maybe it would have been with normal circumstances. But you, really took initiative and did a great job with the interviews and stuff, it seems. So I'm very excited to listen to the whole thing. So just wanted to say that. And also, I guess since it is sort of a question session, I don't want to be I have a comment guy, so I will ask a question. How about, in terms of like the solutions that you were sort of envisioning and kind of talking to folks about, in developing this, what was sort of like some of the things that you thought were like really kind of like short-term solutions, right, to deal with just like the immediate impact of the kind of virus, and do you think that like given like the political capital and whatnot, like what are kind of like the main short-term things that you think are like really important for making sure that there's equity in immigration during this public health emergency?
So I think, something like one of the most major things that came up and that like we've been thinking about is the correlation that kind of what's going on now has to do with voting. And so like one of our biggest fears, and like as well as one of the interviewees' biggest fears, was the fact that COVID might result in kind of a problem in the voting system or a problem in the way that like the 2020 election carries out, which immigration is one of like the biggest issues at stake in the 2020 vote, like, or it's like very major in the 2020 election. And so the biggest fear is that people won't be able to kind of go out and cast their votes on the polls because like not much is being done about like people are rallying and stuff and asking, but not much is being done about how voting is being carried out physically. And so unless like some kind of online voting system is implemented or something, our fear is that like the voter turnout won't be enough and people won't be thinking as critically about immigration to really be thinking about these issues and trying to make a change.
And adding on to Makeda, as Nathan talked about in the background, we've been trying to make hospitals, kind of safe for, immigrants, making hospitals immigration enforcement free zones, and that was rejected. So adding on to that, it's kind of like, how can we give access to everyone, safely give access to healthcare to everyone? And I think that fear is both shown in our interview with Elizabeth. It's shown in our interviews with, city council members, state senators, how they're concerned about healthcare. And also when we talked to our organizations, how they talked about how ICE's and DHS's actions have not ceased, which goes to show that, it really is important that we're advocates for, healthcare access and for hospitals to be immigration enforcement free zones.
Sorry, I also just want to add very briefly that, the recent relief bill that was passed in the House, the $3 trillion coronavirus relief bill, also includes, stimulus checks to undocumented immigrants. And so if that bill is passed, then that will provide, as you say, rather like immediate short-term gain to any immigrants who are suffering through this crisis, such as, Elizabeth, who we interviewed.
And just really quickly, just as a short-term solution, the idea that ICE is still making arrests during a global pandemic is, at least in my opinion, kind of insane. So asking for just at least a temporary pause on immigration arrest at the moment, at least during quarantine, seems like a good first step.
Awesome. Seeing that no one else wants to add, does anyone have any other questions or comments? This is probably gonna be the last few minutes we can ask to the group. So awesome. Vicky, go for it.
Thanks. I just wanted to echo a little bit of what I heard. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really insightful and I learned a lot of things I did not know, and the interviews were really powerful. I'm wondering in the interview process, what you feel like the politicians and the different people you interviewed, where they see the most hope going forward and moving forward in terms of immigration and what you've been talking about.
So I'll start. So I interviewed Jody Zeismer from NILAG, and to be honest, in the short term, she was not super optimistic about the way immigration is going in this country because it just, first of all, before the pandemic even set in, there was such a backlog of cases, that she had to work through. And so she mentioned, she emphasized really at the beginning of the interview that, the coronavirus did not help this at all. It just added more to the backlog. And so the work she had to do was, made more difficult by the fact, of course, that they had to work from home now. They can have they can directly access, their clients. And so in the short term, right now, things are like, to be honest, are not looking that hot, of course. But one of the things that did give her hope, of course, is that, this is an election year. And so if, the person in the White House does leave, then, we could see, I don't want to say short term, but we could see rather, we could see possibly changes in the system coming in the next year, which is it's a very optimistic outlook considering how much the system has deteriorated over the past 30 years in terms of, how long, immigrants have to wait to get visas, how long they have to, how long it takes to process cases. And so, that's where the greatest hope really comes from, is that in this election year, if we all exercise our voices in terms of what we want to happen to the system, then, we could see, very immediate, again, I really don't want to say immediate, but very possibly quick returns in terms of, what we envision is happening to, how we process people coming into this country. And so she was speaking briefly about, like I emphasize the decentralization of the immigration courts to speed up the number of cases that are able to move through them. And that way they don't have to handle as much bureaucracy. I thought that was a brilliant idea. And I really hope that gets implemented within the next couple of years.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. We're going to go with 1 to 2 more questions before closing remarks. So, Alan, you're on mute right now.
Sorry, quick apology. I have a terrible connection, so if you got to move to someone else, I understand it. Thanks. These are fabulous presentations. I'm just curious how you found your interviewees, and if you're going to be continuing the process. So, I mean, it's interesting, sort of thinking of the lawmakers. And I wonder if you've thought about perhaps interviewing people who might not be natural allies, right? Because getting a pro-immigration legislation, especially at the state level, depends in part on reaching, if not across the aisle, to, let's say, Democrats in suburban districts that are a bit more conservative. And I mean, that goes across the board with civil society organizations and so on. How can you sort of broaden the base of support for what are great proposals? Thank you.
Yeah, I could just quickly take this one. So in the beginning, a lot of our interviewees sort of came from introductions through Felipe, actually, and also our own reaching out. So basically, it was just bugging different people for as long as we could. We've been emailing them, we've been calling them, and ultimately, a lot of people did follow up with us. Sometimes they left, like they ghosted us for 2 weeks, and we had to email them again, and finally they gave in. But we were able to get, a group of people willing to speak with us. And then in terms of kind of what we can do to expand the space in the future, we did want to invite actually some more conservative opinions into the conversation. We were actually reaching out to more people. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, that wasn't really able to happen. We wanted to get more interviews in. But overall, we think that it's really important to also get different people we're interviewing to interact with each other in terms of their ideas, right? So we've had a Wendy Chin from NYIC, we've had her kind of give a statement on what she would say to city council members if she could speak to them. And then we showed those clips from her interview to Mr. Menchaca, who's the chair of the Committee on Immigration and City Council, and getting him to hear her ideas. And then also, when we interviewed Elizabeth, we kind of just wanted to get her opinions and see, is there a disconnect between what the government is focusing on and what the communities are actually experiencing. And we think this podcast is kind of one of the ways we can tie together those opinions and have them really interact with each other in one place. And we're hoping that in doing so, and in future endeavors, hopefully if we can get more interviews in the future, just kind of having people who usually don't have face-to-face conversations interact with each other even more. Even during this pandemic, when we're in quarantine, there are still ways we can get people to have conversations, and we think conversation is the first step to progress.
And it was also considering like who necessarily had the time in their schedule, especially with COVID-19, because a lot of people are kind of strapped for time and a lot of people are working from home or not working at all. So a lot of the organizations who did end up having interest in being willing to kind of cut out some time or like work with us ended up being organizations who already were interested in like similar like ideas and similar concepts. And so I think had it been any other time, we definitely would have like tried a lot harder to get more conservative opinions and more opinions that weren't necessarily ours or weren't like other opinions, but because of time and because of COVID-19, we were unable to
Yeah. Just given the fact that we have about 2 or 3 more minutes, I wanted to hand the floor over to Felipe one more time, just to say anything you wanted about the organization you work with, you started, or about the project more broadly.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I gave 2 presentations to the fellows, in consecutive years, and it really was great to see sort of a diverse crowd of politically engaged students. I mean, I'm a freelance journalist, which is part of the reason I have been a little bit more pressed for time maybe than I would have without COVID, right? It's the industry's in a weird shape, and so it's been a lot of like writing, research and stuff. And so, but the one that I run, Borderlines, which is it's sort of a newsletter that breaks down federal immigration policy on a weekly basis. And so, I've been talking to Sanda, who runs this organization for a long time, and it's been great working with presenting to the groups and trying to kind of guide you folks in kind of the general direction that you wanted to go, and making some of those connections. And I hope that my intervention was helpful, and that you can continue on this. And by the way, just as a note, in terms of bugging people and trying to get them to answer your questions, it's an excellent skill to have as a reporter. So I'm glad that some of that was being developed. If any of you ever want to go into the field, it seems like you really were persistent, and you got some good responses. So I'm very happy with that as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, just one more virtual round of applause to everyone. I mean, we already see it in the comments, but this was incredible. Two last things before we head back to, I believe, the regular room for the Kahoot, is the fact that we have already linked the podcast trailer in the chat, so you can copy and paste that into your Safari, Google Chrome, whatever, to check it out. And also, if you want to give any of the feedback that you have on this presentation, you can email it to Sanda, or any of the remaining questions we couldn't get to that we can then forward to the fellows. So this is just the beginning.
I will say, sorry, I'm just coming in. The other groups are running about 5 minutes longer. So if there were questions that you wanted to take, the Kahoot will not be starting for 5 minutes. If there are not, take a stretch break, a bio break, get a cold glass of water. Your call. But 2:55 is where, in the main room, is where the Kahoot will begin.
Okay, awesome. I mean, wow, crushing it with time. I see we have a question from Elizabeth, so I think we can get to that one right now before taking a quick 2-minute break.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations to everybody. I can't imagine what kind of challenges you faced when you, it sounds like, had to convert the mode of research during the lockdown and the crisis, and you handled it really beautifully and put together a very polished final product. I'm curious to know from anybody who has an opinion whether you came away from this venture, the research you did, and then the kind of putting it into a set of recommendations, if you came away thinking that these are recommendations, and these are forms of change that will be better pursued at the grassroots level or at the highest levels possible. In other words, do you think that we need to really focus our energies on comprehensive federal changes? Do you think that there's such a disconnect sometimes between what the rules are and what ICE is doing, that we need to focus on grassroots efforts? Like, did you form an opinion about where we should be putting our energy as we move forward?
Yeah, so I mean, if anyone else wants to chime in, they can definitely. But when I interviewed City Council member Menchaca, who's the chair of the Committee on Immigration, he sort of talked about how there was this kind of struggle for him to talk to people of higher positions in order to get them to implement certain policies. Like, for example, he would talk to the governor and the mayor about, when are we going to build a state or city like stimulus package for undocumented people who are not going to get the stimulus, and the federal government has already started to send this to other people, but certain communities aren't being affected. And the governor was just kind of saying, we still have money for that. And the mayor was sort of saying, we rely on our private partners like Soros Foundation because they just gave us $20 million and we're going to distribute that. So that's it. And we're done. And so he kind of talks about this sort of dismissive attitude, I guess, in his job when he tries to propose certain things. And I think something he did point out, though, is that, of course, the government has to kind of care about what the people care about ultimately. And if there's enough pressure put on them by, the people, then they're going to have to pay attention. So it's sort of this thing where, yes, we have people certain people in government who, could be doing a better job when it comes to executing these policies, but also I think we have a very important role as citizens as well, and that is to actually put our ideas out there and to gather people to support our like a movement or an idea. And I think that's what really pressures government officials to do their job ultimately. And City Council Member Menchaca really encouraged that we put that pressure on our officials to do well. And I think that's something that's really important. We hope that our podcast spreads more information and sort of is the stepping stone to start that kind of movement.
And if I can add on that very quickly, I think that for me, the most important thing that this whole project has really shown is that all of these people are actually there when you call and do want to hear from us as students, as citizens, as New Yorkers, and they are ready to have that dialogue. And it's really shown that the divide between the constituents and the representative is really not as big as at least I thought it to be. And that if you call, if you write, if you ask for a conversation, most people will say yes, and most representatives will hear your ideas, which I think is something pretty powerful.
I mean, I think that's a perfect